Yeah, those are annoying. Those can be annoying. Fair enough. Yeah, we'll get started in 5 after. People are generally late. If there's snacks in the back, if people need water, get you a bottle of water. And then Kevin is also presenting today, but he's obviously not here yet because he's in a meeting. So there'll be a couple more people coming down, at least from that. But we're going to be talking about Aspire tonight, as we continually do, and everyone in .NET is. But we're going to specifically focus on deployments, but we can do an overview as well. So yeah, we'll get started. 3 minutes. But what about other people? So you were MVC. You're getting you started originally. What kind of projects have you worked on in C#? Yeah. Yeah. What about like a long time ago? Sorry, go ahead. No, I haven't been doing it very long. Okay. Oh, okay. Sure, sure. Oh, that's cool. Hmm. Oh, okay, cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's cool. You built a little app for it. Yeah. Kevin will come down. Kevin will come down. We'll be right even. We'll get started in a second. Don't wait for too long. It's summer. People don't want to talk about .NET. There. I don't want to talk about .NET. Summer. No, we'll get started. So we're gonna be talking, like I said, about deployments and CI/CD. We'll go over some of the basics of that, but also kind of in the realm of .NET Aspire. So CI/CD, we'll first cover announcements. So the next .NET user group, August the 4th, always just the first Tuesday. And then the rest of the year, kind of an open question: what do people want? So we've been kind of on an Aspire kick, and that was part of from build. There was a big push, and then Foundry is kind of the other thing. We're not big Foundry people, so if people have ideas, let me know. I would love to continue to cater to what people want to hear about for the rest of the year, because it's kind of up in the air. So we have August planned already, but for the rest of the year, what do we want? And then another, the Spokane Tech Discord. If you're not part of it, that's a great resource for learning about stuff or these different events. So Python is in there, Rust, all the different things. So we're going to go over, like I said, CI/CD fundamentals, .NET Aspire, the overview, and we can spend more time if people aren't familiar, and then some Aspire deployment basics, and then Kevin is going to show his real-world example if he ever shows up. Calling him out because he's here. So first, CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, and I can make this a little bigger. Let's see if I can zoom in. Okay, so continuous integration. So every time you push your code, you're doing an automated build, test, and integrate on every commit. So, when you commit to main, whether that's through a pull request or through a merge or whatever, continuous integration says you should be building, testing, and pushing that code out. So run your integration and unit tests. You should have static analysis and linting. So your code should be, conforming to standards that you want the entire time. But every single time you build, you should be producing build artifacts. This allows for a faster feedback loop and allows for code to always be in a maintainable state. So the main branch is kind of the general one, but that should always be ready to go. And then continuous deployment on the other side of that is automated releases to environments. So when you push to main, you are then pushing your code as a build artifact up to a real environment. So this can be helped with things like infrastructure as code blue-green deployments. And then you obviously, once you are fast deploying, you need rollback strategies and monitoring and observability. So generally, in the world of DevOps, the closer you can get to these ideals, the better your code is going to be, and the better your project is going to be. Because as you're moving fast, the entire time you're validating at each step. You're not allowing code to build up and then have a bunch of, okay, this big release, there's this big moment of, is this going to work? You kind of get away from that with continuous deployment. So just kind of a overview of what the CI/CD pipeline flow will look like. When you push code to main, during the CI portion of the first half, you're building and testing. So with .NET, you should be doing unit tests. You can have things like integration tests. You can have end-to-end tests. You can have accessibility testing, like full on, build up the front end, call it a day, make sure your front end goes to all the things, and then publishing, right? That's now the next step of going out to a stage and being ready for a build artifact, and then sending it out to, in this case, we have staging and we have prod. But at each step of the way, there's a gate. So each state gates the next. Failure just stops the pipeline. So if your code doesn't test and it doesn't pass all the tests, it's not going to merge, right? If your code doesn't build, that's even a step before, which is bad, right? You should be testing. But if it doesn't build, you shouldn't be hitting the test stage. If your then code doesn't publish correctly, it's not going to go out to the environments because the build artifact isn't created. So why Aspire matters in this is because Aspire is already an opinionated cloud-ready stack that helps you build observable production-ready distributed applications with .NET, but it combines a lot of these things into code that CI/CD wants you to have. So it gives you orchestration so you know what you're running and what you're trying to go with a project. It gives you components to then deploy in a standard and reusable way, things like Redis, Postgres, RabbitMQ. And then there's tooling, obviously. And then the biggest thing is Aspire has built-in ways to deploy to Azure, AWS, or other cloud providers with manifests. Now, when you get to the gold standard of CI/CD, you want pipelines and you want actions and these kind of things. So everything's automated. But we can kind of build up to that. So the first one that we're going to talk about, so there's kind of two different CLI tools that Aspire has. And there is the Aspire and then the AZD. AZD is Azure Developer CLI, which is kind of the older way of publishing. But there is, let me just make sure that we are live and good. Check that. I think we're good. Yeah, we're good. But so we have Aspire Publish. This is one CLI tool, and what this gives you is target-specific artifacts as a one-way handoff. So it doesn't actually do the publishing for you, or it doesn't do any of the deployments for you, but it's just saying, I'm ready as an Aspire project to be pushed to an environment. So we'll go over it a little bit when we jump into code, but what an Aspire project really has at the center of it is an app host that orchestrates the rest of the project, and it just kind of details out what is actually in my app. So whether that's a database, whether that's an API, a front end, those kind of things. So in this deploy test, there is just an API. So the only thing that happens is the pipeline execution and the publish. Those are the kind of two steps, and they take very little time, right? And what this allows you to do is, in a specific artifact, you're either getting Docker files or Kubernetes manifests. It preserves a lot of those unresolved parameters, so then when you want to send it out to your real environment, you are dictating what actually is done. So for this dummy example from a GitHub action, to actually deploy this, you're using Aspire Publish to this environment, and then you're running a Docker build because I know that I'm deploying out to a Docker registry, and that's my deployed environment, right, for staging. So other one that exists is AZD. And this is the older way to do it, but it still can be done, and it allows, AZD is really nice for quickly building an app and just seeing what it would look like when it's deployed, right? Testing out the different things. The Azure Developer CLI is still supported, but no longer the recommended default deployment path. But if you just type the commands azd init and then azd up, you will then be walked through a wizard to deploy your app to Azure, right? Azure is, or AZD is Azure Developer CLI, so obviously it's going to be Azure specific, but that those two commands will get you a deployed application. So if you have an API, if you have a web front end, and then it's all in Aspire, you would actually build out what's using Azure Container Apps by default, a deployed site. So you could test out, hey, are my connections correct, or is it just working locally? So there's a couple reasons that you might still use AZD, but typically, especially in a real project, you should be moving away from that. So, if you have existing bicep templates and AZD infrastructure, if you already have the AZD pipeline config, if you want or have a team that already kind of wants all these things, you can go from it. But for older projects, if you already have deployed your site, there is this Azure with AZD resource naming, because there's very specific ways that it deploys your project. And we'll look at an example in a second, because it gives you ugly names when you deploy things from Azure. But really, the next one that they want you to move to is Aspire Deploy. So this now generates the target output, resolves parameters, and applies the deployment in one operation. So it doesn't actually consume previously published assets. It's just a fully self-contained command, and you need to rerun to push updates, and there's things that it does behind the scenes to provision things like Azure Container Apps, container registries, and log analytics. So Aspire Publish and Aspire Deploy are slightly different. They're moving towards Aspire Deploy because it's a CLI tool, so they can move pretty quickly. But this just is quickly getting you to where CI/CD can actually come in. So but the gold standard for deploying code should be a pipeline. With whether that's ADO or GitHub or wherever you host your code, you should be using a pipeline that builds and runs your tests, either uses Aspire Publish or other methods, and then builds your container, and then actually deploys it to the target environment. So why CI/CD with Aspire Publish? A lot of it is super nice. You get to own each step of the deployment, and you have full control over the secrets, the approvals, environment promotions. But it's also really nice with the app itself, right? You don't have to specify a lot of different commands or the build order. You get to use the same things that Aspire has in here. So the GitHub action, right? You .NET test it, Aspire Publish, and then you just go and deploy your site. So then why Aspire in the first place, right? A lot of these things are just general code practices, right? CI/CD should be for any project and every project. And that doesn't show up very well on the TV, but a lot of the things for Aspire around it, external to the local just F5 experience, is the built-in service defaults. So structured logging, like we've talked about last time, distributed tracing. The Aspire dashboard actually appears in Azure nowadays, right? If you have a container apps environment or otherwise, you get a Aspire dashboard. So you can literally open the dashboard that you run locally on a deployed Azure website. And I didn't mean to skip by that. And then finally, the Azure Monitor and Log Analytics integration. You can also use that through the Azure dashboard. And then here you can just see in the bottom left, this is me actually deploying from a GitHub action my Aspire app. So when you get this is using AZD because it was an older app, but it literally, part of it links to the deployed Azure Aspire dashboard, and you can actually go and look at it. So we're going to dive into code. Is there any questions? I went through that pretty quickly, and if you want, we can go back through what Aspire is or more basic. Not too excited. But we can also go through that when I'm walking through the code. I don't want to take too much time because Kevin has a pretty cool little demo to show of a real life Aspire deployment, and it's massive, right? CI/CD is super helpful for establishing the basics, but really quickly you learn why you want these kind of practices, because having to do that manually would suck. Any questions? Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. So the question was, if I don't want to use GitHub or other Microsoft products, can I still leverage Aspire for the logs and the dashboard? Absolutely, right? So locally, the Aspire dashboard is just that. It's just a local running process on your .NET app. And then when you want to deploy it, you're choosing your providers. So if you don't want to use GitHub or otherwise, right, you won't use like the AZD tool, but you could use a standard pipeline in whatever provider or whatever, Bitbucket or ADO or another GitHub clone. They all have actions or similar that will allow Aspire to just build and publish. So Aspire Publish, like I said, does not actually target a deployed environment. It just gives you the artifact to then say, now this .NET executable, this program can be then deployed anywhere. Does that make sense? So DevOps as a practice could be whatever you want, right? You could have it. You could have scripts that then deploy. DevOps is like the idea of you just continuously deploy your code out. How you deploy that code out is up to you. Um, typically it's going to be YAML because then you could use Terraform and other things. But however you want to deploy your code is how you want to deploy your code. So, and Aspire specifically, like if you wanted to go after a Python script, you would be taking a .NET publish. So you would need the .NET command, and then you could execute that, and then say, hey, I have this artifact, and then I take that as my input to the Python script, and then run with that. Because once you have Aspire publish or Aspire deploy or other those things where you have the build artifact itself, it just becomes a .NET exe because it's just a program that runs along with a dashboard. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah. So the comment was Aspire's kind of growing to a more agnostic framework. I mean, that's their idea, right? They want it to be tooling for any project. So they have different app hosts that you can run. So another one being TypeScript. So you can actually write your application of Aspire in TypeScript, and all that's doing is just pulling the pieces together. So Aspire is not necessarily tied or married to .NET. It's only designed to be a codified version of your application. So we can look at the app host in a second on more complex applications where then you have queues running and you have databases and you have an API and then a front end, and then it kind of outlines all of those things in a code file. So very similar to how we moved towards codifying our infrastructure with Terraform or other things. Orchestration and the app host orchestrator codifies what are the different pieces of my app. So for a distributed application, for things that have more than just front-end database and API, it's really nice to actually look in the repository and say, I know exactly what my application is doing because it's all listed out explicitly in Aspire. So yeah. Yeah, well, and I think Aspire is quickly becoming the coolest thing in .NET because it's meant to transcend it, right? It's not meant to just be, oh, this is now just how you do some random .NET worker service. It's designed to how you do any sort of code, if that makes sense. Which is obviously a much bigger ask, but a cool one. Any other questions? That was a great question, though. A great comment as well. Well, we'll dive a little bit into code. Kevin, how much time do you want? Okay. Okay. That's not helpful. Thank you. Um, you are not helpful, Kevin. I know. Okay, we're gonna go a little bit into just the basics of Aspire, just to look at the code really quick, to give a little bit of the backstory before we get more into it. So I have a series of .NET templates, and I imagine everyone can read this. Let me zoom in. I can. Okay. So I like Angular as a front end framework. I know, shoot me. But I have a simple template that just generates up a Angular app connected to a .NET API. Super simple, no database. But we can see from this app host. So app host is the project type, and specifically here, it is a SDK of type Aspire app host. I'm a little out of date because I just .NET Nude, and my template is a NuGet template, so it's a little out. But so there's a specific type of project here. But then within this app host, very simply, I have an API, I have a front end, and I run it. Right? Very simple application, right? This is what you would consider a very simple app, right? Front end and API, there's nothing else. There's no other distributed pieces, there's nothing else. But you can really quickly, without even looking at any of the code, any of the projects, in my solution explorer, I don't even see my Angular app, but I know that I have a JavaScript app somewhere because I've codified it in my app host with Aspire. So, and my app host, another important thing to note, is this with reference. My front end has a reference to my API, which makes sense, right? A front end, in this case, is going out to an API. I'm just gonna F5 this. It's loading up. So this is the dashboard that we talked about earlier, and that you might have seen before. But really quickly, we can see a list of list of resources. So a couple things to note: I have an API that's running. I have a front end that's actually in the waiting state because I have a front end installer. We say, oh, what is this actually doing? Go to the logs, and it might not say anything. There we go. So as you might expect from a JavaScript framework, I was just doing an npmi. So I added a JavaScript app. It knows that start up, and npmi just installs the node modules and the required dependencies. But now I have a link to both my front end and an API. So obviously, I don't think I have anything on my API side. I didn't put a Swagger page. But I click the URL on the front end, and I can now go instantly to my Angular app. So here I'm just using the standard minimal API to go after the weather, and it looks like today or tomorrow it's going to be balmy, and then on the 9th, unfortunately, it's going to be freezing. Very sad. So, right, super simple. I have a very nice app, and I get structured logs for what's going on. So you can see that I had some warnings, I had some information, and then traces. I can actually look through who was calling, and I don't have the web logs because I'm lame, but I called /API for the /weather forecast. So if I had then a database that it went out to wherever, and then went out to a queue or an Azure function, it would trace all the way through that it has access to. So, right, this is the reason Aspire is cool. It has these sorts of things built in. And just quickly, we'll look at one other piece of code in this kind of very simple example, where all the magic actually comes in. Because if you look at this program CS, this is going to look like a pretty standard API, right? Just right out of the box, everything's very standard. The only one that's not is this add service default. This is the clue then to look somewhere else, because there is something providing all of the niceties of Aspire. Kevin likes to say Aspire is just turning on all the switches of C#. So in this big, long extensions that define service defaults, we're basically just flipping on all the nice things that C# has configured, but not many projects actually use. So things like standard resilience handler, service discovery, things like I'm going to configure OpenTelemetry out of the box. I don't need to do anything else, but I just now have, when I do program.add add service defaults or configure service defaults, add service defaults, sorry. I get metrics, I get tracing. If I want a gRPC client, I can undo that and just add my extra NuGet package. I'm getting an exporter where I can say, oh, I have an Azure application or I have an Azure monitor, an Azure monitor really quickly, and I don't have to configure anything else outside of this service defaults project. And then finally, the health checks and default endpoints just says for my app and for my dashboard to know what's running. And the project probably failed because I was being annoying. Okay, that's fine. I'll probably need to reload. That's fine. But that's how it knows that there's a green check mark on the app. So the front end's actually running because it sent a health check. The back end is actually running because it sent a health check, and I was able to ping it. So really quickly, you get something pretty cool. Now, as you get more complex within, let me pull up this. But as you get more complex, the app host only grows in, what's the right word? Helpfulness, because it helps you dive down into what you're actually looking at within a project. So I'm going to pull up one of our projects here. That the app host is just massive. There is a million and one things going on, but I don't know anything about the project, but I can really quickly understand, okay, at a minimum, I can look at what is going on. I'm pulling it up right now on the other screen. Sorry. No. Now, so we have this project that has a database, but it has queues, it has processors, it has Azure Blob storage. I don't even know if I can name all the things it has. But as we scroll down, migrations as an executable, it has Azure storage, it has queues, but it's all named here, right? I don't have to go and say, oh, what thing do I need downloaded on my dev machine? I come to this project, presumably, and I press F5. And it starts running, and I see an application out. So I don't have to configure any of these things. You know, this is a queue storage or a worker process, No, this is just this is Visual Studio opening up a new tab. But if you wanted, you could pull this up in 100%. You can open that up in VS Code and have the web browser, and then have AI be able to have access to all these features as well. So do the same thing here. Go Aspire run. It probably needs to be in the right folder. Let's see. Yeah, I'm a Visual Studio person myself, so I stick on Windows for that fact. Yeah, fair enough. So I won't take too much more time because I think diving into a more real-world example is going to be super helpful. But that's kind of the basics of CI/CD with Aspire, right? Aspire helps you fall into the traps of making better code, but then you can start building out pipelines and deploying your code. So that'll be it for me. Kevin, you want to come up? Perfect.
For everyone online, I was mimicking what Dan was doing in the back. So you were wondering what that was. That's what it was. Okay. Hi, everyone. Kevin Bost, currently a senior software architect. Okay, so I am going to show off shamelessly my own stuff. And so this is VeloPack. This is my company. I'm one of the founders. We have a cool website. We do stuff. Kind of just wanted to highlight the question earlier about Aspire and .NET related stuff. It absolutely runs because Java, JavaScript, Python, Rust, Swift, Tori, go down the line. We are running all the things because multi-languages are cool. For anybody who wants the brief overview, if you're building a thick client application, i.e. desktop application, and you want an installer updater framework that just works out of the box and doesn't make your head hurt, Wix, this is the solution for you. But since most people probably don't care about desktop applications, we are going to go straight to the back-end side. So this is my back-end API. For those people who care, the VeloPack SDK and tooling, free, open source, knock yourself out, have fun. If you want me to host your installers and make all of that work nicely for you, this is my SaaS. So this is a closed source repo, but as I am one of the owners of the company, I give myself permission to show it. So we're going to go down that route. So this is an Aspire-based application. And like Dan was showing off, I fire it up. I've got a bunch of resources all dialed in here. I've got a storage account. We use Stripe for our payment processor, SQL database. I've got an admin API, my main front end. I've got a partner integration for people who want to do reselling. I've got payment processing, upload processing, my main API, all the things. I'm like, Dan, I actually put a Swagger page on my API, so booyah. I'm just going to claim credit there. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight here is most of the time when people are working with Aspire, you kind of get hinted at this idea of going down like a mono repo type route, right? And you don't have to. So just want to highlight something really quick. I have my API, which is what is actually hosting my Aspire app host. But my front-end code for the front-end website is a separate repository. There is no hard link between these two. They can rev independently back and forth. The key thing here is very similar to what Dan showed earlier in that if we go down a little ways, I am actually literally just hunting out a submodules directory and pulling it in. Now this doesn't have to be a submodule. I just did a get submodule as a way to kind of keep the repositories linked together in a meaningful way, but you can also just have it live in a neighboring directory. Because your app host is just code, whether that be in .NET or TypeScript or Python. Did they release the Python SDK for the Aspire one? I don't remember. Is it in preview? It's a thing that is coming one way or another. But because this is just code, we can go through and leverage it to do codey things. We can say, hey, if this other directory exists, then I actually want to add in my JavaScript application so that I get that other resource. That way, if somebody clones this repository, maybe they don't init the submodule, that directory won't exist. And so in that case, when they F5 and launch the Aspire host, they'll get most of the services set up. The system will be in a working state. But if they want to run the front end, they will have to actually go through and add in the submodule init or otherwise. Which tends to be a fairly simple thing. Most people who have dealt with the multi-repository problem are probably familiar with README docs and PowerShell scripts and other sort of ways of, hey, here's how we onboard. This now can kind of codify that onboarding to say, this is the way we're going to actually start and launch this application. The other thing, and I'm going to go a little bit against Dan, you'll note that I don't have a lot of the publishing stuff inside of my app host. Right? I have purposed my app host for my personal local app development, and I am not publishing from Aspire. So the Aspire deploy, Aspire publish is nice. However, it does kind of push you down one path of having to codify all of your environments inside of an app host. Whereas I want my infrastructure to live beyond my app host. If I decide that I want to stand up a region in the East US and one over in Europe, I don't want to have to change anything about my app host. I want to change my pipeline and my infrastructure. I don't want to have to deal with any of that stuff. So to that end, I also put all of my infrastructure stuff over in another repository. This one here is entirely Terraform. And again, I won't necessarily bore people with the fun, exciting details, but I have a region module inside of my Terraform that defines out what a region of my application is going to look like. It defines my container app service, SQL database, my storage accounts, my queues, my managed identity, my key vaults, all of the thingies that I need to make one of these apps stand up and start running is defined inside of my infrastructure repository, which is completely independent of my Aspire app host. Now, this, in my mind, is actually an asset, not a liability, because it means if I decide I want to go host somewhere else, I'm not locked in anywhere. To your question earlier about maybe not wanting to always host on Microsoft-related stuff, my infrastructure is independent of Aspire. I could Terraform and point this at AWS if I wanted to. I could decide, you know what, container apps were cool, but container apps are out, Kubernetes is in, we are going to deploy our own cluster and go to town. That's a thing I can do. And Aspire continues to still be my local orchestrator for being able to stand up, debug, and deploy. And I can still turn on the Aspire dashboard on my container app service out in Azure if I want to, but I don't have to. And I think that's the big reason why I see Aspire fast as it is because it gives people the choice to continue working the way they have been. It brings things to the table without saying you need to change your workflow to do these things the Aspire way. If you aren't, starting brand new and you want a good set of defaults to start with, it's very happy to give you those defaults and say, here, if you are brand new, this is what Greenfield should look like. This is, like Dan was showing with the service defaults, this is how you should set everything up. So I want to highlight one other thing in here. When you first go through and spin up a Aspire project, you will get the app host, and then you will get something called service defaults. You'll note that does not say service defaults, because I took that project, and when you first spin that service defaults project, it gets generated once, and then Aspire goes, you know what? These are what we think are good defaults to start from. Do with this what you will. And I said, thank you very much. I will do with what I will, and I got rid of it. But what I didn't do is get rid of everything that it did. So the adding service defaults still exists. I just put it in my own file and relocated where everything was at because I still wanted all of those same defaults. I still want open telemetry. I want my telemetry to exist. I want all of my services publishing out their telemetry. I don't want it bound to any Microsoft tech. Open telemetry will go everywhere. And if we go down here, as we can do configure open telemetry as a good example. And then I want to go through and I intentionally have set up tracing pointed at my own namespace saying, okay, I'm only really interested in stuff that comes from Velopack. Just the rest of it, I don't care. Like that's somebody else's problem to deal with. But then down also in my open telemetry exporter, I've gone through and said, okay, let's configure application insights as well, right? I'm in Azure. Let's use the Azure things. Again, you saw in Dan's template that was still commented out because I believe that's the way it comes out the gate. You'll note I've left Prometheus off because I'm like, I'm not using it, don't want it. Don't need extra ingest if I'm not going to make use of it. But I am making use of application insights and Azure Monitor because I want to know when exceptions happen. My phone gets to buzz every single time one of my users causes an unhandled exception, which unfortunately there's a timing bug right now, so my phone buzzes about 8 times a day, which is really exciting. Really annoying. I'm getting annoyed at that stack trace. But it does give me an easy way of saying, okay, Aspire, I want to set this up, and when I spin a new service, everything references the same service defaults. The idea with the service defaults project is it is a common set of functionality that you want all of your services to have. Most of the companies that we work with, they always have their own, we do things this way, we configure our logging this way, we set up it because this is how we're hosting or this is our process. Aspire says, great, codify that into your service defaults, And then all of your services pick up those same defaults and then start running and using them. Questions, comments, concerns? Cool. Okay, so let's take a look a little bit more as far as what Dan was showing. So I'm going to back up all the way, and where's my VS Code? So I'm going to drop into here. So Dan had made a great comment about everything as far as deployment and getting stuff out the door relies on some form of CI/CD. Now, I'm in GitHub, so this is all GitHub Actions-based YAML that I am using. With that said, you could go to AppVader, you could go to Azure DevOps, you could go wherever you would like. The important part is not the YAML around it, but the actual invocations on each of these that are being done, right? The first one, we're checking out the repository. We're going to log in to Azure because I have, this is an infrastructure-related project. I'm going to need to do infrastructure-y things with Azure because that's where I'm hosting. Get my Terraform, and then the rest of the pipeline is pretty agnostic about the rest of my infrastructure hosting, right? It would obviously be different if I was going against AWS, but the Terraform ends up being effectively the same. You're going to initialize your infrastructure. You're going to, in this case, I do a format check because I really hate it when I don't format things nicely, and so I have my pipeline smack me up the head if I don't do it. Then I build the Terraform plan. So people who are unfamiliar with Terraform, Terraform is just an infrastructure as code, a way to codify what resources go out there. It builds the plan, deploys it out. And in my case, the key thing is it's going to be putting out the infrastructure that my Aspire host wants. So I know I've got all of these various container services. So I have a container app environment where this thing goes. It builds, deploys, uploads, and then pushes the plan out. And you'll note there's no checks on this. I just YOLO my infrastructure straight out because there's no way I'm going to make a mistake. Put an actual check on your deployment. That's bad. You should have an approval gate. But as the only person committing to this repository, I am my own approval gate, so we just don't do bad things. Okay, let's go back up here, and then I want to grab on the other side. So there are a couple ways that I have gone through and deployed out an Aspire-based application. Because the core of Aspire that it does is it stands up a multi-application environment and registers the configuration. Because anybody who's dealt with trying to stand up an environment manually knows the pain of port numbers of I now have to make sure that my front end is pointed to the right localhost port number of my back end. And heaven forbid I have two things that want the same port number. So I got to make sure everything's different. But now that we have Git work trees and agents, the odds of two of those things starting at the same time and wanting the same port number is very problematic. Great, we can go through, like Aspire has a wonderful feature, -- isolated on the Aspire run command that will randomize your port numbers for you. That's wonderful for avoiding port number collision. It's a metric pain because now you have to make sure everything is wired together, because if I randomize the port number of my back end, my front end needs to know about it. It still needs to go to the right place. What Aspire does, especially in the .NET space and also in TypeScript, Python, and a handful of others, is mostly through environment variables. But it registers up configuration pointing to where those services are at. So in our service defaults, we had service discovery that was turned on. It is right there. Look at that. Found it the first try. And if we go back to our resources up here, and we will just pick on my front end resource. If I scroll down, I will see a whole bunch of environment variables. And some of these are related to the OpenTelemetry configuration that goes in so that it knows where to send its logs, because if you don't configure your OpenTelemetry, it will send the logs to nowhere. But then it also ends up configuring my base URL. So you'll note, right? So that even if I go through and randomize my port numbers, it's fine because the Aspire app host will still wait for the back end to start up. It'll look at what that endpoint is that it stood up, take that endpoint, feed it as an environment variable to my front end, through environment variables. And then that's what gets read in so that it knows how to communicate back and forth. Dan? Yes. Yeah, so Dan's comment there of inside of your app host, you can figure up that dependency between your services. You tell it what it needs to wait for. Again, some people are probably familiar with seeing README docs of, okay, to start up our application, you first start the back end, and then once it's up, then you go ahead and you do your NPM command to start your front end, and now everything is up and running. Whereas with Aspire, you tell it, okay, on my front end, do not start until the API service is actually started. And this actually goes one step further, because just telling it to wait for the back end, it's not just waiting for a process run. It's actually waiting for a health check to go green. So it's not just saying, have I started the back end? It's saying, has the API service started and has its health check returned to 200? Now I know that it's not just running, but it's actually running, and the health check is claiming that it's able to serve up requests. This is incredibly important when you get into a container-based environment like container apps or Kubernetes, because that's how those environments know when your container is actually ready to service requests. If those health checks don't go green, you'll end up with a back-off loop where the host, Kubernetes or the container apps, will just kill your container over and over and say, you didn't start responding in whatever the health check configuration is. I think it's 30 seconds on startup. Don't quote me on that. But if I don't get that 200 response, I'm going to kill you and restart you because I'm going to assume you hung on startup. And the only rational thing I can do is kill you and try again, because as everyone knows, turn it off and back on again. That is how you solve computer problems. And so they've just codified that out in the cloud to make your life easy. Because we all know if it was hung, what would we do? We turn it off and back on again. So they just do it automatically for you. Dan? Yeah, so Dan's comment there of there's more than just wait for. There is wait for completion. So for example, if there is a script or similar that you add as a resource that you want to run, you don't want to wait for that script to start. You want to wait for that script to return a 0 exit code. Yes, or a specific exit code, because the, oh, can I get it? Oh, look at that. Oh, I don't know. I know it's supposed to be impossible, but it turns out I'm that good. Oh. Well, I know. I can't. I have to work with me here. There's an exit code parameter you can set if you wanted to watch for something different, because a handful of things use negative status codes or otherwise to indicate different forms of success. Terraform, hypothetically speaking. But when building out your Aspire-based application, it's that kind of setup that now takes you from having to document this and script this kind of startup process out to something that's codified. And more importantly, even though I'm not using Aspire to deploy everything out, I still have that same structure where when my app host starts, I'm fairly confident I'm going to run fine out in the cloud. Everything's containerized. There's a handful of things that could go wrong because of differences. Because when I launch at least a .NET application, my .NET applications are running under my Windows environment. But I'm containerizing them in a chiseled Ubuntu image out in the cloud. So there are a handful of differences, and I've been occasionally bit by them. But most of the time, for at least web-based applications, the difference between a Linux and a Windows-based runtime is fairly minor. File paths being a notable exception, localization and culture info being another common pitfall that bites you. Of don't assume that the decimal separator is a period. That's bad. It will bite you. So, or that everything's in English, because that is also not a true statement involved in here. But for deploying these things out, again, Dan kind of showed a brief thing, and I won't dive too deep into here. But the basic premise of all of this is the pipeline goes through and builds out the artifacts, running the tests. And you can see I've got UI tests and backend tests and integration tests and PR numbers and code review checks and all kinds of other things. But the important part is after all of those things, and actually, you know what, we're just going to go out to let's just go to the repo. That's the infra one. But I had the right one up. Clearly not. Nope, that's agents, actions. Wrong one. Come on, GitHub. I know that's what I said. That's not what I meant. Let's see. Yeah, I have AI. I expect it to do what I mean, not what I say. So my actual deployment here ends up looking a lot more like this. So if it would let me zoom in more, that would be cool. But apparently, this is as far in as Zoom will allow because reasons. But the key thing here, build goes through and produces a bunch of artifacts. In my case, these artifacts are container images and a zip file for my front end, because my front end, unlike Dan, I like React. So we're doing React, not Angular. But that zip file ends up getting deployed out to an Azure static web app, which is just static app hosting. Again, pick your favorite app hosting that you like. I go through, I migrate my database before I get too carried away with anything. And there's checks in there to make sure that I don't have or I should say my tests back on the build stage verify that there are no breaking changes to my database, because that would be bad. And then all of these things over here end up being container app deployments. Again, these could be replica sets in a Kubernetes cluster if I wanted as well. And I have my integration path down here. But my integration job, you'll note, is not a dependency for deployment, right? There is no arrow here. Bad. And the reason is because on my integration tests, I've already run them prior to my merge into main. So before I even get this far, my integration tests all have to pass. And my integration tests are functionally full end-to-end tests. Because this is an installer updater hosting service, it generates an app. It compiles the app. It adds the update bootstrap to the application. It builds version 1, builds version 2. I think it actually builds versions 1 through 8, if I'm not mistaken, because I have enough tests that I needed a lot of versions. And it goes through and it publishes the updates. It checks for updates, pulls them down, verifies the app runs, and keeps going. The app is not interesting. It's a console app that basically has one output. What is my version? And check for updates. And that's all it does, because that's all my integration tests needed. Is I just need to make sure the app goes up and down and publishes and that everything works, because that's the most critical code path in my entire application. Is if people cannot publish their updates or download their updates, people are angry, and that is bad. Versus like the admin or partner ones, if those go down, the admin ones affect 2 of us, the partner ones affect 0 of us. So I deem that blast radius as acceptable, because my partner's far enough away that he'd have to cross an ocean to yell at me. So we're going to just assume that I'm safe. Sorry, Kaylin. Okay. Questions, comments? Makes sense. So again, not to go against what Dan said with the Aspire deployment. Aspire deployment is great, and it works especially well, and it works very well for individuals wanting to push something out, because there are a lot of cases where you cannot run things perfectly locally, right? AI is the big thing, Azure Foundry being a prime example. You aren't going to, well, I don't have the compute power to run some of the language stuff locally, right? That is not a reasonable ask for a lot of people's machines. You're going to have a remote Foundry instance. There is going to be things that you need to test in Azure because it involves auth. In Azure, their managed identity back and forth. You can't test managed identity locally. By definition, it's managed by Azure. It doesn't run on your box. It's only up in the cloud. And so to make sure that you've configured your managed identities appropriately so that your backend can reach the database, can talk to Foundry, can pull back information, you need to deploy somewhere. And in those cases, an Aspire deploy to a dev environment or otherwise makes a lot of sense. It's an easy way to go from what is my environment here running in the cloud and having it going. However, at least the way we've structured a lot of our apps here, when it comes to saying, okay, that's great, but now I need a full enterprise grade environment. right? I need a prod, I need a pre-prod, I probably have a testing environment. How do I capture those environments? And more importantly, how do I capture the differences? Because even though it's nice to be able to have matching environments is almost never what you want. You don't want an exact replica of prod as your testing environment, maybe a pre-prod environment because you need to do load testing. But oftentimes the cost of exact replication of prod is way too high. And so there are likely differences, even if sometimes they are superficial, lower skews, smaller replica counts, less memory or otherwise, because just replicating prod gets fairly expensive fairly quickly. And so having a lower environment that you can go through and leverage makes that a lot easier. In my case, I took this because you'll note it doesn't look like I have a pre-prod environment anywhere in here. I actually secretly do. I've taken my container app environments, and container apps allow you to have named replicas. So when I'm deploying these things out from main and sending it all the way out the door, it's not actually quite getting all the way to prod. It's getting all the way to my container app environment, and it's running under a named replica. In this case, dev, in my case. But it's running under the same infrastructure that prod is running on, but it's running in a separate replica that then I can just flip the switch to say, okay, now this one gets to go to prod. Obviously, things like the database are still being migrated, which is why it's important that I validate my migrations ahead of time. I can't break things because my pre-prod and my prod environment are running against the same database, which is convenient. I can tell right away if a code change is going to break something. It does mean I have to be very careful on the database migrations, but it does give an easy way of pushing that out there. So in those situations, I still go back to the same, I shouldn't say same, the way that I've done this for a while of I still infrastructure as code my cloud-based environment. Still deploy out. I still very much love Aspire for doing it and managing it, but there is a clear separation for me between whether I'm using Aspire to deploy for my own testing inside of Azure, where I think the Aspire deploy works really well for, versus whether I'm trying to deploy an enterprise-grade set of infrastructure that I want to deploy out onto. Questions? Ramble on. Go once, go twice. Anything anybody wants to see? Got a closed source repo here that I'm willing to open up. Care to see it? There's nothing revolutionary. That makes you feel better. There's some cool stuff in there, but it's, I think sometimes people's imagination is probably cooler than what's there. So we can go with the imagination version and just assume that it's golden. Yeah. It depends on what you mean. So Swagger still exists and out of the box in a lot of cases. So because there is, so Open API is still very much a thing, which is the spec that Swagger runs on. So since you asked, right? So the JSON file that you generate here, this is still very much alive and well. You'll know I'm running OpenAPI 3.0, 3.1 is a thing, haven't updated. There's complicated reasons for that. But you'll note I'm running Swagger as just a generated front end for this. But there are other alternatives. Like Swagger still gives you a nice, easy way of having an interface on here. Why am I blanking on the other one? Yeah, I can't. The word cursor keeps coming to mind, but that's not the right word. There is another one out there that is slightly newer. But at the end of the day, all these are doing is generating you an interface to go against your own API. For TypeScript clients, Hey API has been my go-to for generating my front end. It's actually what we're using in my React application to generate a strongly Scalar, thank you. Scalar, see, I knew. Yeah. The other thing that a lot of people have been leveraging as well is not doing web-based ones. So there's built-in support for .http files inside of VS Code and Visual Studio as a way of getting that same interaction. Because most of the time when people wanted a Swagger page, what they wanted was an easy way to test their API, right? I put up an API, I want to hit the endpoint, I want to control payloads, I want to do all of that. The advantage of like the .http files is now you can like check in like pre-canned payloads if you've got like use cases that you want to run through repeatedly. So it makes for an easy way of having that I want to test my API quickly. Because the problem with the Swagger endpoints is once I terminate this run and kill this browser window, I've lost all of my data that's there, and I have to re-go through all the now for some payloads it doesn't matter. It's trivial. Most of us know how to open up Notepad and keep a running, you know, paste buffer, and we're off to the races. Yeah. Exactly. And I think for a lot of people, because Postman also gives you an easy way of kind of generating up a bunch of requests from an open API document, and using something of that nature. Again, it's not a web-based interface for your API, but there are alternate tools that I think people have been using to get the same kind of behavior without necessarily doing it. And Swagger's still there. Like I've had this in for 3.5 years because it was cool when I started it and I left it there and it was like, great, and it keeps working. But I will say most of the time when I'm testing my API, I'm not necessarily going through my Swagger page. I am going through my TypeScript client to be able to hit it directly. Because at the end of the day, that's kind of what I want to test anyway, because that's what's going to be consumed by my front end rather than going through this here. But for one-off requests or otherwise, absolutely, it works great. Other questions? I like it. It's fun. Hopefully later tonight, my deployment bug goes away too. So, thank you online, people. Yeah, so Podman for orchestration, yes. I've used it, and we've got another engineer upstairs, Kelly, who uses it as well on Aspire-based projects. For Aspire, there's an environment variable you have to set to tell it not to use Docker, to set it to Podman to be able to go through and run. I am secretly hoping that, so at Build this year, Microsoft announced WSLC, so containers for WSL. Inside of Windows, which makes me very excited to no longer need Docker Desktop and just have native containers. Last I checked, was not yet supported by Aspire. However, there is an item and they are working on it. I just don't know where that landed. Because I tried to cheat it at one point and was like, well, WSLC has a similar CLI interface as Docker. What if I just reroute Docker exe to WSLC, and didn't quite work, it fell over. So there was options that were different and it didn't handle it nicely. And if you change that environment variable for Aspire, the only two values it accepts are Docker and Podman. And if you change it to something else, it throws an error at you and says, stop it, you can only put in those two values. I may have tried multiple versions. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Yep, you've hit on one of the exact reasons why I think Aspire has started to gain some of their popularity as well. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Oh, nice. Yeah, and I think those types of setups is very few apps. So, because I was talking with the PM on the Aspire team, and I asked the question of, you know, like, what is Aspire for? And they're like, any multi-tiered application, which is almost every application nowadays. It's very rare that you have an application that doesn't have multiple components, right? Maybe you've built a console app that's a simple tool that's by itself. Aspire's overkill, don't waste your time. But almost everything has a database. Almost everything has some extra component that goes along with it. And having something to manage that for you and then codified is valuable. And like you said, some people have their pre-existing environments where, hey, we set everything up this way, we've got this configured. And the fact that Aspire lets you take that and just kind of bring it in without it forcing you to say, no, you must do it the Aspire way. It's like, if you want to reference a JavaScript application and a Python app over here, go for it. Yeah, and I didn't highlight it here, but the other one that I have up here, so I do Stripe for the pricing stuff, and you'll note I just have an arbitrary Stripe container for running their CLI, right? Because normally with Stripe, you'd have to go out and hit their API and you want webhooks and that kind of thing. But in my case, it's like, no, their CLI app functions as an invoker of the webhook. So I can go through, simulate a purchase on the Stripe web API. This thing then takes the webhook, calls my local host environment, and I get that webhook and I can debug through and step through. But there's nothing fancy here. This is, if you go out on Docker Hub, there's the image I'm running. On Docker Hub, you'll see that there's an environment variable that says, put your API key here, and I just codified that in Docker. I could have easily scripted this in with, like you said, various Docker Compose or otherwise to stand up that kind of orchestration around it, or I could just have it start for me and up and running. It is a very nice way of being able to take what knowledge is in my head and then put it in somewhere where when somebody else comes onto the repo, they can clone, run. That should be as hard as it is. Obviously, they don't have the environment variable for my API key. That's a different problem. They have to ask nicely if they want that. Dan. Thank you very much.